Greetings and welcome to my webcast of January 12, 2012. This is going to be the second lecture. It's going to be a short lecture, but I have a couple of other things for you to look at regarding the founding of the Constitution, founding of the state. I'll be back on Tuesday, and as far as announcements are concerned, I posted a couple of links on the home page which I'd like you to look at. And I'd like you to look at the discussion of classical liberalism first, and then a very nice reading and discussion of Federalist 10, which makes it easy to read that particular reading for this week. I'm also going to open up a discussion page on the website that you can then enter your comments or questions on. You can discuss things with one another, anything from the subject of the course to the textbook, which I've been hearing something about. The textbook is expensive, but I did notice that there's a very, very lively resale market for the textbook on eBay, including the GSU edition. That's the nature of the business these days. Because there is such a large market for resales on textbooks, the textbook manufacturers have to recoup their entire expenditure on their first run, and so the textbooks are very expensive. That's the bad news. The good news is I'm seeing the resale on eBay up to $110. So you're really going to probably get most of your money back if you want to spend the time on it. It's a good book, and I think it's worthwhile. The theme of the book, Gateways to Democracy, is a frank admission on the part of the authors that there are different ways to access our political system. I think it's pretty obvious to anybody who watches politics these days that what we're seeing here is we're seeing a system in which there are lots of different ways to access the system, not just including through the vote. In fact, I'm going to argue that later on when we talk about voting, that the act of voting is only moderately effective in terms of influencing the government. There are lots of other ways of influencing the government, and Americans generally take advantage of that. But today what I want to talk about is I want to talk about the origins and the founding of the United States. Because I think it's important to understand where we've come from to understand where we're going. The American Revolution is not a classic revolution. Most revolutions tend to be the battle of classes. The middle class against the ruling or aristocracy or something like that. The American Revolution was really American elites against British elites. And the British elites were quite tone deaf in hearing what American elites had to say. The British elites had a colonial structure. The colonial structure, when operated successfully, eventually granted independent states, which are still part of the British Commonwealth, states like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth. But in the case of the United States, the British did not have a good system for administering the colonies. The British system for administering colonies was based on the principle of mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that states that are most successful are the ones that capture as much territory and then squeeze as much resources out of those territories as they can. In other words, you treat colonial possessions as conquered territories. The problem is, at least for the British in regards to their relationship with the United States, is that the United States, while it was originally populated by Native Americans were basically killed or run off. So the population of the United States was basically people who considered themselves to be British subjects. And as such, they considered themselves deserving of rights under the British Constitution, rights that had been laid out hundreds of years before in the Magna Carta and had been fought over just in the last 100 years, counting back from the American Revolution, in the English Revolution. They thought they were British subjects, and they thought as British subjects they were deserving of the rights of British subjects. The problem is the colonial administration treated colonial peoples as subject people and did not give them the full rights of British subjects. And so what you have is you have a British colonial system which is not responsive to the demands of the people who consider themselves to be British subjects. In fact, right up to the outbreak of the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin wrote a piece in a newspaper where he begged the king to treat him as a British subject. And I have a feeling that if the British Parliament had listened to what the colonialists wanted and granted them representation or whatever as British subjects, that we would have a picture of the Queen on our money today, and that we would be a lot like Canada, and there would have been no American Revolution. But be that as it may, there were too many vested interests in Britain on exploiting the American colonies, and they resisted the attempts of a number of members of the British Parliament to include the United States or the American colonies as full and participatory communities within Great Britain. So we could have very well ended up like Northern Ireland, Scotland, or Wales, but we didn't because it was just too profitable not to do it that way. The main complaint that the colonists had, I'm sure you've heard a lot these days about the whole idea of taxation. The main complaint that the colonists had was not in the idea of taxation itself. That's where the Tea Parties, the modern Tea Partiers get it wrong. The objection was not to taxation. The objection was to taxation without representation. In their attempt to wrench or to glean as much of the resources as possible from the colonies, the British monarchy and the colonial administration imposed a tax on all transactions in the United States or in the colonies. And the proceeds from those transactions, by and large, went back to the home state, went back to Britain. Not only that, they didn't allow American manufacturers to process American goods, and they didn't allow the raw producers of those goods, like the cotton growers in the South, to sell their products within the colonies. They had to sell it back to Britain. Britain would then process it through British factories and then sell it back to the United States or the colonies as a British product with a substantial markup. In other words, there was not only a direct tax on the American colonies, there was an indirect tax on American colonies, and at some point the colonies had had enough. And so what we have here is a discussion of rights in the broader sense, but it really is a lot of the American Revolution, a lot of the dispute of the American Revolution is kind of mercantile. It's over money, and money will force a lot of people's hands. Look where the money goes. That's what they often say in politics. But at its basis, the American Revolution is part of a really broader world movement. It is part of a conflict between what I'm going to call classical conservatism, which is related to the conservatism of our day, but in ways which I'll discuss in a little while, and classical liberalism, which is related to the liberalism of our day, but is different in some ways, which will be discussed not only on the short tape that you're going to take a look at, but also I'll give it a shot when I come back. Classical conservatism is the ideology that justified the rule of kings. It was the dominant ideology of the Middle Ages. It really is the dominant ideology from 1000 BC until 1800 AD. In other words, it was the dominant philosophy for most of the history of civilized mankind. And classical conservatism is, in a lot of ways, a pre-scientific ideology. In other words, classical conservatism is an explanation for why things happen in the absence of any other logical explanation. So prior to the scientific revolution, if, for example, your crops were destroyed by a hailstorm, your tendency would be to say something like, well, you know, God's will. I did something wrong. I was punished. I deserve that punishment. I don't know exactly why, but the Lord works in mysterious ways, and that's the way things are. And so that's a sort of an explanation of why things happen when you don't have any other alternative. We now have an alternative. If you say that my crop was destroyed by hailstorm, then I can start talking about rising currents to the clouds and condensation and ice forming and all this other stuff, and I can get this explanation for why things happen. It's got nothing to do with what I did to my wife last week or something like that. I mean, it's got, or the fact that I didn't go to church or something like that. It's hard from our perspective to put ourselves in the shoes of classical conservatives, because it's a philosophy which is frankly behind the times. Classical conservatism is not dead. Classical conservatism exists in places like Saudi Arabia and Iran. There are still places in this world where science is rejected, where the dominant government is ordained by, at least seen to be ordained by God. The Saudi Arabian family traces its lineage to the Prophet Muhammad, and the mullahs in Iran claim to get their inspiration from the Quran, and have God on their side. That's a kind of a strange, from our perspective, kind of a strange philosophy, although there are elements of that even in the United States today. Well, let's get back to what I was talking about, the founding of the American state. At the time of the American Revolution, the dominant philosophy of the day was classical conservatism. Classical conservatives believed that society was like a human body, in the sense that the human body has many cells, and the cells each have a different role. We have skin cells, we have liver cells, we have brain cells, blood cells, whatever. And each one is created for a particular purpose. Well, like the human body and like the cell, people are born into society. And they're born into society for a specific purpose. Women are born into society to produce children and to take care of children. A modern reflection of the classical conservative philosophy in that regard is something to the effect that the woman's place is in the home. But they went beyond that. They went beyond gender. They believed that if you were born a peasant, you were meant to be a peasant. If you were born the son of the king, the firstborn son of the king, you were meant to be the king. And that you served as king as a representative of God on earth. Now, when a cell begins to divide uncontrollably, or when a cell does something in an organism which it's not intended to do, we have a term for that. It's called cancer. The same idea is associated with classical conservatism. It is the idea that if somebody tries to do something for which they were not suited, for which they were not intended, for something for which they were not put on this world, they were not only a threat to society in the same way that cancer is a threat to the body, but they were actually committing a blasphemy. So, if in a classical conservative society you had a bad king, and a bad king in classical, I'll talk about what a bad king is, but if you had a bad king, the explanation for